Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and we're now going to talk about tennis and the upcoming French Open Grand Slam tournament, which takes place on the 27th in September. And in particular, whenever you talk about the French Open, you of course talk about the player most synonymous with the tournament, certainly for the last 14 to 15 years, and that is Rafael Nadal. And we're going to talk about now his chances for winning the tournament, and if so, can he deemed then to become the greatest player of all time within the game? Because as you all know, if he wins this tournament, he will match the Grand Slam tally of 20 Grand Slams, which is currently held by Roger Federer. And this will indeed again spark off the debate about who is the better player between the two and who is the greatest player overall within the game. So the reason I think it will spark off that debate and Nadal can perhaps claim to be the greatest is of course because, as we all know, certainly for the last 13 to 14 years, perhaps the most hyped up commodity within all of the tennis game has been the great rivalry between both Federer and Nadal. This is a rivalry of course that started way back in 2004 within the Miami Masters, where Nadal beat Federer for the first time, I believe when he was 17 going to his 18th year in terms of age, and that sparked off a great competition between the two. This is of course was in the era of Federer's dominance within the game, primarily from 2004 to 2007 when he was winning really 3 slams a year almost, and Nadal was really seen as the only player who could consistently compete with Federer over that era of dominance. Of course, Nadal initially started as being a major competitor over the clay, but over the years from 2004 and 2007, he of course progressed and evolved his game, and he started to become more successful on grass. And of course the rivalry really hit its apex moment from really 2008 to 2010, where you all know of course you had those two iconic finals, both in Wimbledon 2008 and Australian Open 2009, both brilliant matches full of iconic moments, both during the match and after the match as well. And the rivalry between the two has been seen as sacred by many tennis fans, because it was that one element that tennis could really use to cross over into the general public and sports fans alike. And there's been many debates back and forth over the years who was the greater player. Of course, for the most part, Federer's been in the ascendancy, which he would do of course because he came into the game much earlier than what Nadal did. There's a 5-year difference in terms of age between the two, and Federer has always been ahead of Nadal, normally 3 ahead of him, but as the years have gone by now, Nadal has managed to narrow the gap, and currently now the gap stands at 1. So Federer has 20, Nadal has 19. So people spark the debate again, not only because you match the amount of Grand Slams, because once you match the same amount, you then have to look into amount of wins between the two, the head-to-head record, where were those Grand Slams won, the time period, the level of competition. There are so many other variables of course, but my overall argument has been, if you protest Federer to be the greatest player ever, and then you have another player who has a winning head-to-head against Federer, who has a winning head-to-head over most of the Grand Slams against Federer, and then manages to equal or surpass his Grand Slam tally, then surely that player must at the very least be as great as Federer, if not greater, right? That's just pure logic, okay? Now people will point, yes, okay, maybe Djokovic now has a winning head-to-head against Roger Federer as well, but you have to remember that a lot of those wins were accumulated when Federer was really in his aging years, whereas Nadal had accumulated a lot of his wins when Federer, as I mentioned before, was in his peak years. That the peak era he had of 2004 and 2007, Nadal was able to compete and many times beat Federer, really going into late 2007 and then overall 2008, and then after that 2009 and 2010. So Nadal was able to still compete and beat Federer when Federer in his peak and prime years, and that's the ultimate difference. That's why I don't esteem as much to the Djokovic head-to-head against rivalry against Federer as what I do against the Nadal head-to-head against Federer. So if we look at the French Open itself now this year, we all know that the whole tennis tour was really shook up by the COVID-19 outbreak. Wimbledon, of course, was cancelled. US Open got pushed back a bit, but they managed to go ahead of the tournament without fans in the stands, and for the most part it was a very successful endeavour. There were no real incidents or breakout cases within the people that were within Flushing Meadows. We all of course know that Dominic Thiem won with his 5-set victory over Alexander Zverev. Nadal, the defending champion at the time, chose not to defend his title this year due to the COVID cases. French Open, of course, which normally takes place in late June, now has to take place in September after the US Open, and there was a lot of controversial debate around that, having a clay court tournament so shortly after the US hard courts, but they're still going ahead of it. They will actually have crowds this year. I read recently that they will separate the crowds within the 3 show courts that they have on here, the Philippe Chartier, the Suzanne Longlong and the Simone Mathieu courts, and they will have them in separate zones, and the crowds will not be allowed to intersperse and interact with one another. So that's a very controversial decision as well, considering what recently happened with the AIDA tournament in Belgrade. Of course, we had all the controversy. You can check out the channel for the video of my thoughts on that particular incident. So despite all of this shake-up, they're still going ahead of the French Open. Nadal, we all know, recently came back to the tour within the Rome tournament. He was beaten by Diego Schwartzman in the quarterfinals, and he wasn't in the best of forms, but then you would kind of expect that, because after such a long break in terms of competitive tennis, you wouldn't expect him to hit the ground running, though we all know if Nadal was in his prime that he would have been able to beat Schwartzman comfortably in 2 sets. So that's really the burning question. Can Nadal come back and still win the French Open despite being out of the game in terms of competitiveness for so long and not really scoring any major tournament wins? We all know the nature of Nadal. He is somebody who has to really play his way into form. He's not like Federer, who can kind of spend 2 or 3 months out of the game and then come back and just hit the ground running straight away. Nadal has to build that consistency in terms of his shots, in terms of his matches. He's someone who likes to play these long rallies so he can get his way into his form. He's not someone who likes to win points quickly. He's not a servant volley, as we all know. So it will be interesting to see what sort of form he will come into. He has experienced previous years where his form hasn't been the best. If you look at particularly 2014 and 2017, he didn't win hardly any Masters tournaments going into the French Open, and he still managed to win the tournament in those respective years relatively comfortably. So he of course has the experience, and he would of course have the experience having won a tournament just the 12th time. So he knows what he's doing, and he keeps himself in great physical shape. He's got the experience, he knows what needs to be done. This is of course his favourite service. So I think when you factor in those attributes overall, you've still got to make him the favourite overall at the tournament. But let's look at the potential draw that he has and the potential opponents that he can come across, and if there are major threats that could expose the fact of his lack of competitive matches. So we go first of all into round 1, and particularly you could have Gerasimov in the first round. I wouldn't anticipate any issues or problems in that round. That should be a relatively straight sets win. We go into the second round where he could have Daniel Evans or Nishikori. Now Nishikori, I wouldn't think poses too much of a problem. Clay isn't the best service for him. Dan Evans, you know, is a bit more competent. Many people are picking him to beat Nishikori. I don't think that's quite an easy result as what some people predicting. I think Nishikori has a chance, but if it is to be Dan Evans, I think Dan Evans could maybe take a tight first set off Rafa, maybe catch him off his guard, win it 7-6, and then Rafa should be able to come through and win overall in 4 sets. Now the next potential threat, and I think this could be the major shock if it does happen, is Fabio Fognini, and I think that would be the 4th round potentially. Now we all know Fognini, the nature of his game, he's very much of a zone player, right? So he's someone that is all one pace, one intensity, right? So when he's hitting the lines and he's getting the shot deep and he's hitting the ball very early, taking it on the rise, he can be a major threat. But of course, he can get very erratic and scattershot and make a lot of errors, right? Because he's just hitting the ball so hard and striking it so early. And he has actually scored a couple of wins over Nadal on the clay in the last couple of years. And again, this is because if Rafa goes into the game and leaves the ball short, Fahini can really step into the shots, strike the ball early, hit the lines, and really take away a lot of the initiative from Rafa in terms of the rallies and be ultra aggressive against him. The key to beating Fahini, of course, is to keep the rallies long and in terms of the shot length, and give him different angles, different spins, and don't give him any rhythm on the ball that he can settle into and start really blasting the ball hard and get some consistency. And that's what Rafa's going to have to do. He's going to have to be really on the top of his game and be aware of the potential threat of Fahini. So if there's going to be a potential early loss, I'll probably think it will happen against Fabio Fognini if it does. If Rafa gets through that, he could potentially get Alexander Zverev in the quarterfinals. Again, I don't see too much of a threat there, because Zverev, okay, yes, he got to the US Open final, but again, he's not particularly a specialist on the clay. And again, we could put an asterisk towards this. He didn't really have to come through a lot of high level competition to get to the US Open final, and I really wouldn't rate much chances against him against Rafa. Again, he may take a set because he's got a big serve, yes, and he's very young and very athletic, so that may factor into play. But I'd like to think if Rafa gets to this stage at this point and hits really hard consistent form, then I don't think Zverev will be able to compete with him over the course of 5 sets. So I'll predict a 4-set win against Zverev. Now, the big question, of course, is the semi-final, and where he could potentially beat Dominic Thiem, as I mentioned before, the US Open champion. Really now, an experienced slam contender now, because he's been in a couple of slam finals. He lost to Djokovic, of course, recently in the Australian Open, and he has, of course, been the most consistent threat to Nadal on the clay. He got to a couple of French Open finals, I believe in 2017 and 2019 as well. So he has really, even more so than Djokovic, been the main threat for Nadal on the clay, and everybody has said he will be the natural successor to go and dominate the French Open once Nadal has finally retired. We'll wait and see if that happens, but certainly now, having just won the US Open, Dominic Thiem will have a lot more confidence under his belt. There may be a bit of issues because, of course, he's had such a small time to rest after the US Open win. I think he may participate in Hamburg. I don't know if he's going to do that yet. So he may struggle a bit to hit his way and find his way into form going into this tournament. But again, as I mentioned before, he's been to a couple of finals at the French. It's consistency there as well, so he knows what he's doing as well. So that could be a potential real 5-setter, and I think Rafa will have to be at the real top of his game. If Rafa plays to his 100% best level, then I think he will beat Thiem. We go back to their match at the Australian Open quarter-final this year. Rafa really should have beaten Thiem. He was dominating him, the better player, but his serve just let him down on there, and that was on a hard court. So I still think overall Nadal is a superior player to Thiem. He's just got to be on the top of his game, and if he does, I could potentially maybe see it go into 5 sets, but I think Rafa will prevail overall. And I think Thiem is even a bigger threat than a potential match against Djokovic in the final. Now, we all know, of course, if we're being honest, Djokovic is probably the superior player to Nadal. He's the one player I think that can compete with Nadal when he's playing at 100%. I think if Nadal plays at 100%, he beats about 90 to 95% of the tour. It's only Djokovic that he really struggles with on all 4 surfaces, and Djokovic, of course, is capable of beating Nadal on clay. But again, we don't know how Djokovic will come through with this tournament. I think he could potentially meet the likes of Medvedev. He has got Konechnov earlier on in the draw. I think he might meet him in the 4th round, but Medvedev could cause him a bit of problems as well. So we'll wait and see on that. But again, that could be potentially a 5-setter. It all depends how Rafa comes into form. Now, the fact that if he's got to go through Fognini, Zverev and Thiem to get to the final, that should be a high enough level of competition to elevate Nadal's consistency and form going to any potential final against Djokovic. So he really should be match ready by then if he manages to come through all of those list of opponents in convincing fashion. And if he does, and there's barring no injuries or physical ailments that he suffers, then I would still pick him to beat Djokovic in maybe 4 close sets in the final. Now, if he manages to beat Djokovic in the final, as I've mentioned before at the topic of this video, will he go on to become the greatest? Now, as I mentioned already, I believe he does, because if, again, you mention Federer, if you call him the greatest and you put in all of Nadal's winning stats against Federer, And if you really take on Nadal's own achievements, because the amount of Masters wins he's got, the amount of times he's won the French Open, he, like Federer of course, has won on all 4 surfaces multiple times. So the argument of Nadal only being great on clay has gone years ago. I think, you know, that was cemented as well with his 4th US Open last year as well. So no one can doubt his all surface prowess. He's, I think, just got under 200 weeks at number 1. You know, he's had multiple Masters tournaments, he's had multiple wins over most of his opponents, he's got a head-to-head winning record over everybody barring Djokovic, but that's only a deficit by 3, so you wouldn't bring that too much into dispute. So that's the really only asterisk I could throw at Nadal about him not being the greatest, is the head to get Djokovic if he does manage to win the French Open. But if he does win the French Open, then for me, I will probably deem him the greatest, or at least as great as Federer, because they will both be matched on 20, and if you throw in all of his other achievements against Federer, again, I always say, if you can beat the greatest player time and time and time again, consistently on all 4 surfaces over a period of 14 and 15 years, then you have to be at least as great as that player, right? That's just pure logic. Right, you can throw other stats and achievements can be spun many other ways as possible, right? But at the end of the day, if you're calling Federer the greatest, and then you have Nadal, who's beaten him consistently over a long time span, who manages to equal his Grand Slam tally, because that's the overall barometer. We can talk about Master tournaments, weeks at number 1, and consistent runs of victories, etc, etc. But the one major stat that sets everybody in terms of who is the greatest is the Grand Slams, right? So if Nadal matches Federer's Grand Slams, then he has to be equally as great, right? So that's really what we're looking at here, and I do firmly believe that if Nadal can put off this French Open, it may be one of his greatest tournament wins ever, because of the fact he hasn't had many match competitiveness, so he wouldn't have hit a great amount of form. And despite the fact that, yes, he's won it 12 times, I know, but we're going into a different state of the game and a different phase of the game as well. So if he can still emerge victorious after all this time, particularly if he beats TM in his semi-final and Djokovic in the final, if he can overcome those 2 players in that sequence, then that will really cement him really as, I think, overall the greatest player of the game. We already know he is the greatest player on clay, that's undisputed. No one can even argue against that. But if he can win and just match Federer's tally, right, and I think the fact that it'll even generate debate, I think, is enough to question mark on whether Federer is now overall the greatest if Nadal manages to equal this Grand Slam tally. And I do overall believe that if he does do it, he will become, for me, the greatest player of all time currently. Now, of course, this could change if Djokovic goes on, but again, Nadal was still ahead of Djokovic. That'll put him 3, because Djokovic is currently on 17 at the moment. So if Nadal, it's very crucial for him not only to catch Federer and give him a chance of surpassing him, but also to keep Djokovic at bay as well. So as I mentioned before, I do believe that if Nadal goes on to win the French Open this year, he will overall become the greatest player within the tennis. Now let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree with my statement? Do you not agree with it? Do you have many arguments? I'm sure many people will. They will throw other statements and statistics and achievements and many other records that Federer has over Nadal. But I'll go back to it again. If you call one player the greatest and another player is able to score a numerous amount of wins over that player over a number of years, over various amount of services, then that player has to be as great as the one that you're claiming to be the greatest. So that's my view overall. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.